my younger sister's 35th birthday. Celebration was being held at one of the nicest event venues in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and nearly everyone in our extended family had shown up. My mother was in her element, greeting guests, soaking up attention, and making sure everyone knew how proud she was of her favorite daughter. As the night went on, she stepped onto the small stage and tapped her glass for attention. The room fell silent. For several minutes, she spoke glowingly about my sister. According to Mom, she was brilliant, successful, ambitious, and practically perfect. None of that surprised me. I'd heard versions of that speech my entire life. Then my mother laughed and looked directly at me. "And of course," she said, smiling at the crowd, "we're proud of both our daughters. One built a real career." She paused as several guests chuckled politely. "And the other is still working on her little projects." A wave of awkward laughter spread through the room. My stomach tightened. It wasn't the first time she'd embarrassed me publicly. It wasn't even the worst thing she'd ever said. But something unexpected happened. Several guests stopped laughing. A man standing near the bar looked genuinely confused. A woman across the room raised her eyebrows and exchanged a glance with someone beside her. Another guest nearly choked on his drink. Their reactions caught my attention immediately. They weren't looking at me with pity. They were looking at my mother as if she'd just made a very serious mistake. Mom didn't notice. She continued smiling, clearly expecting me to laugh along like I always had. Instead, I smiled back. Then I calmly said something that made the entire room go silent. Not awkward silent, stunned silent. And the look on my mother's face told me. She finally realized she didn't know nearly as much about my life as she thought she did. My sister, Lauren, wasn't just the favorite child. She was the standard by which everyone else was measured. From the time we were little, my mother treated every achievement. Lauren made as proof that she was destined for greatness. If Lauren brought home an A, Mom called relatives to celebrate. If she joined a club, Mom proudly displayed photos around the house. If she won a small award, you'd think she just received a Nobel Prize. Meanwhile, my accomplishments seemed to disappear the moment they happened. I was the responsible one. I studied hard, worked part-time jobs, paid my own expenses whenever possible, and rarely caused problems. But responsibility isn't nearly as exciting as being the family star. When I earned scholarships, Mom said I was lucky. When I graduated with honors, she pointed out that Lauren had been more popular. When I landed my first professional job, she asked why it wasn't with a more prestigious company. No matter what I did, there was always a reason it wasn't enough. Family gatherings became predictable. Someone would ask how I was doing. Before I could answer, my mother would somehow redirect the conversation toward Lauren. If I mentioned a promotion, she'd remind everyone about Lauren's latest accomplishment. If I shared good news, she'd find a way to make it sound smaller than it was. At first, I kept trying harder. I thought maybe the next achievement would finally earn her respect. Maybe the next promotion. Maybe the next milestone. Maybe the next success. Eventually, I realized something painful. The problem wasn't that I hadn't achieved enough. The problem was that my mother had already decided who I was in her story. Lauren was the success. I was the backup character, and once someone decides to see you that way, facts rarely change their mind. What I didn't realize then was that my mother's obsession with appearances was creating a blind spot so large that one day it would embarrass her in front of everyone she wanted to impress. As adults, Lauren and I chose very different careers. Lauren followed a path that everyone immediately understood. She worked for a well-known corporation, had an impressive job title, and posted polished updates on social media. Every promotion came with congratulatory comments, professional photos, and plenty of attention. To my mother, it was the perfect career because it looked successful from the outside. I went in a completely different direction. After several years in a traditional job, I left to start my own consulting business. At first, it was just me working from a small home office, taking on projects and trying to build a client base. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly didn't provide the kind of status symbols my mother loved talking about. The moment I became self-employed, my family started treating my career like a hobby. Whenever relatives asked what I did, my mother would smile and say things like, "She's trying to run her own little business," or "She's still figuring things out." Never mind that I was paying my bills. Never mind that my client list was growing. Never mind that my income had already started surpassing what I'd earned in my previous job. None of that mattered because it didn't fit the image my family preferred. Over the years, I stopped sharing details. When I signed a major client, I kept it to myself. When I expanded my services, I said nothing. When my business hit milestones I once thought were impossible, I celebrated quietly. It wasn't secrecy out of shame. It was exhaustion. Every time I shared good news, someone found a way to minimize it. So eventually, I let them believe whatever they wanted. If they thought I was struggling, I didn't correct them. If they assumed my business was small, I let them. What none of them realized was that while they were busy comparing me to Lauren, my career was growing into something far larger than they could imagine. The first strange reaction happened at a family barbecue. One of my aunt's neighbors had been invited, and during a conversation, my mother casually made one of her usual comments about my small consulting business. The woman looked at me for a moment. Then she asked, "Wait, is your company called Northbridge Strategies?" I nodded. Her eyes widened. Before she could say anything else, my mother jumped in and changed the subject entirely. At the time, I pretended not to notice. But it wasn't the last time. A few months later, a distant cousin visited from another state. During dinner, he mentioned seeing an article about a growing consulting firm that had landed several major contracts. He looked directly at me and asked if it was the same company. Again, before the conversation could continue, my mother redirected everyone's attention somewhere else. It happened often enough that I started expecting it. A family friend asked surprisingly specific questions about my industry. A former classmate recognized my name from a professional conference. Someone mentioned a business podcast. Someone else referred to an interview. Every time I watched the same pattern unfold. Confusion. Recognition. Then my mother quickly steering the conversation away. The strange part was that I never corrected her. I could have explained everything. I could have listed accomplishments, contracts, and milestones. But after years of being dismissed, I no longer felt the need to defend my career. If people wanted to know what I did, they could ask. Most never did. They were too comfortable believing the version of me they'd already created. Still, each awkward interaction added another crack to the story my family had been telling themselves for years. And sooner or later, those cracks were going to become impossible to ignore. I just didn't realize the breaking point would arrive at one of the biggest family events we'd ever had. By the time Lauren's 35th birthday approached, my mother had turned it into a major event. Calling it a birthday party barely did it justice. She rented an upscale venue, hired caterers, arranged professional photography, and spent months coordinating every detail. Family members flew in from different states. Friends, co-workers, and business contacts were invited. My mother talked about the event constantly, as though it were a celebration of a celebrity rather than a birthday. None of it surprised me. For years, important moments in Lauren's life had been treated like family milestones. The rest of us simply showed up. Part of me considered skipping the event altogether. But despite everything, I loved my sister. Our relationship wasn't perfect, and she rarely challenged our mother's favoritism, but she wasn't the one making the comments. So I decided to attend, smile politely, and get through the evening like I always did. At first, everything seemed predictable. Guests mingled. Music played softly in the background. My mother moved through the room, collecting compliments about the decorations and organization. Then I started noticing something strange. Several people I didn't recognize seemed to recognize me. One man gave me a surprised smile when we made eye contact. A woman near the bar looked as if she was trying to place where she knew me from. Later, another guest approached and introduced himself with a level of familiarity that caught me off guard. None of them were relatives. Most weren't even connected to my side of the family. Yet more than once, I caught people glancing between me and my mother with expressions that seemed oddly confused. It was the same reaction I'd seen before at other gatherings. Recognition, followed by disbelief. I had a feeling some of those guests knew things my family didn't. And as the evening continued, I couldn't shake the sense that something significant was about to happen. As dinner came to an end, my mother stepped onto the small stage near the dance floor and tapped her glass. The room quieted immediately. She began exactly the way everyone expected. She talked about Lauren's accomplishments, her intelligence, her career, and all the reasons she was proud of her. Guests smiled and nodded. Family members applauded at the appropriate moments. I sat quietly listening. Then my mother shifted the conversation. "People always ask me how I managed to raise such a successful daughter," she said, gesturing toward Lauren. The crowd laughed politely. Mom smiled wider. And trust me, it wasn't easy. More laughter. Then her eyes landed on me. For a split second, I knew exactly what was coming. I'd seen that look before, the look she got whenever she was about to make me the punchline. Of course, she continued. I'm proud of both my daughters. The room relaxed. Then came the next sentence. One of them built a real career. A few people chuckled. Mom paused dramatically. And the other is still busy playing businesswoman with her little projects. This time the laughter was scattered and uncertain. Some guests laughed automatically. Others looked uncomfortable. I felt dozens of eyes shift toward me. The familiar sting hit immediately, not because the comment was new. Because it wasn't. It was 20 years of criticism packed into a single sentence. Every achievement dismissed. Every milestone minimized. Every comparison. Every reminder that, in my mother's eyes, I would never measure up. I glanced toward Lauren. She looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Several relatives smirked into their drinks. A few seemed to be waiting for my reaction. And then I noticed something else. The unfamiliar guests weren't laughing. In fact, they looked shocked. One man stared at my mother as if she'd just announced something absurd. A woman across the room exchanged a bewildered glance with her husband. Another guest looked down, clearly trying not to react. That was the moment I realized something important. The people who actually knew me weren't embarrassed for me. They were embarrassed for her. And suddenly, for the first time in years, my mother's words lost their power. Standing there at the party, listening to my mother's joke, I couldn't help thinking about the years she'd never bothered to ask about. The truth was, my business hadn't been built overnight. It started with uncertainty, long hours, and more risk than anyone in my family ever realized. When I left my traditional job, I didn't have wealthy investors, family connections, or a safety net. I had a small amount of savings, a laptop, and a belief that I could create something of my own. For the first few years, I worked constantly. While friends went on vacations, I stayed home finishing projects. While relatives gathered for holidays, I often left early because deadlines couldn't wait. There were nights when I worked until 2 in the morning and started again before sunrise. There were months when every dollar went back into growing the business. Slowly, the effort started paying off. 1 client became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became more than I could handle alone. I hired my first employee. Then another. Then a small team. Every milestone brought new challenges, but it also brought growth. The company expanded into new markets. Larger clients arrived. Opportunities I once thought were impossible started becoming normal. The funny thing was that my family never saw any of it. Partly because they weren't interested. Partly because I stopped sharing. Whenever I mentioned progress, someone found a way to diminish it. If revenue increased, it was luck. If I landed a major contract, it was timing. If the business grew, it somehow still wasn't a real job. Eventually, I learned something valuable. Not everyone deserves front-row access to your success. Some people only want updates so they can criticize them. So I focused on building instead of explaining. Year after year, while my family continued telling themselves the same story about me, my life kept moving forward. And by the time of Lauren's birthday party, the gap between what they believed and reality had become enormous. The only thing they didn't know yet was just how enormous. As the awkward laughter faded, I started noticing details I had missed earlier in the evening. The man near the bar wasn't just another guest. He was the CEO of a company that had been one of my largest clients for nearly 4 years. A woman standing beside one of Lauren's co-workers wasn't a stranger either. She sat on the board of a nonprofit organization I'd worked with on several major projects. Near the dance floor stood a business owner whose company had partnered with mine multiple times. The realization hit me all at once. These people weren't connected to me through family. They were connected to me through work, and somehow through mutual friendships, professional circles, and Lauren's guest list. They had all ended up in the same room, which meant they had just heard my mother describe me as someone struggling with little projects. The expressions on their faces suddenly made perfect sense. They weren't confused about who I was. They were confused about why my own mother seemed to have no idea who I was. I caught one executive leaning toward another guest and whispering something. Both glanced in my direction. A moment later, a woman covered her mouth as if trying to hide a smile. Not a mocking smile. The kind of smile people have when they know a conversation is about to become very interesting. Meanwhile, my relatives remained completely unaware. They were still operating under the same assumptions they'd always had. To them, I was the less successful daughter, the quiet one, the one who never quite measured up. What they didn't realize was that several people in that ballroom knew the truth, and unlike my family, they knew exactly how absurd my mother's comments sounded. The atmosphere in the room was changing. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough that I could feel it. The balance of power had started shifting. The only person who didn't seem to notice was my mother. And unfortunately for her, she wasn't finished talking. If my mother had ended her speech after the first joke, the evening might have unfolded very differently. But she couldn't resist. Still smiling, she raised her glass toward Lauren once again. That's why tonight is all about celebrating real achievement, she said proudly. Years of hard work, a respected career, and success that everyone can see. The room applauded. Then she laughed and added, maybe some of that will rub off on her big sister someday. A few relatives laughed louder this time. One uncle nearly spilled his drink. A cousin shook her head and smirked. The joke wasn't even original. I'd heard versions of it for years, but hearing it in front of colleagues, clients, and complete strangers felt different. Not because it hurt more, because it suddenly seemed so small. For the first time, I wasn't embarrassed. I was tired. Tired of pretending the comments didn't matter. Tired of allowing other people to define my life because correcting them seemed pointless. Most of all, I was tired of watching my mother create a version of me that existed only in her imagination. The room gradually grew quiet. People were waiting to see how I would react. Some expected anger, others probably expected me to laugh awkwardly and let the moment pass. That had always been my role. Keep the peace. Smile. Move on. Instead, I stood up. I picked up my glass and looked at my mother. The confidence on her face suggested she thought she had won another round. She had no idea what was coming next. I smiled politely. Not a forced smile. A genuine one. Then I thanked her for her concern. Several guests exchanged curious looks. My mother frowned slightly. And before anyone could interrupt, I calmly began explaining what I'd actually been doing all these years. The room was so quiet I could hear glasses being set down on tables. I smiled at my mother and lifted my glass slightly. Actually, Mom, I said, my little projects have been keeping me pretty busy. A few people chuckled nervously. My mother gave a tight smile, clearly expecting me to make a joke and sit back down. Instead, I continued. I started my consulting business 8 years ago. Since then, we've grown into a company with clients in multiple states, a full-time team, and partnerships with organizations I'm incredibly proud to work with. The smile slowly disappeared from my mother's face. Several relatives stared at me. I wasn't finished. I briefly mentioned a recent expansion, a major contract we'd secured, and an industry award the company had received earlier that year. The room went completely still. Then something happened that I hadn't planned. The CEO standing near the bar spoke up. "She's being modest," he said. Every head turned toward him. He explained that his company had worked with mine for years and credited our team with helping solve problems that had transformed part of their business. Before anyone could process that, the woman from the nonprofit added her own comments. Then another guest. And another. One person mentioned a conference where I'd been a featured speaker. Another referred to an article about my company. Someone else talked about a project that had received national attention. With each comment, my family's expressions became more stunned. The people who knew me professionally weren't exaggerating. They were simply describing things my relatives had never bothered to learn. The most revealing part wasn't what these guests said. It was that my mother looked genuinely shocked. Not because she thought they were lying, because she was hearing the truth for the first time. Years of assumptions, comparisons, and dismissive remarks suddenly collided with reality. The daughter she'd spent years portraying as unsuccessful wasn't struggling at all. She simply hadn't been paying attention. For perhaps the first time in my life, my mother had no response. She stood at the front of the room holding her glass, looking completely unprepared for what had just happened. The woman who always had an opinion suddenly couldn't find any words. Around the ballroom, conversations started breaking out. Guests who had laughed at her joke moments earlier were now looking at me very differently. A few relatives stared, as if they were trying to reconcile two Completely different versions of reality. One cousin, who had spent years making sarcastic comments about my career, suddenly asked, "Wait, your company has employees?" Another relative asked how long I'd been running the business. Then someone asked about the award that had been mentioned. The questions kept coming. Not because people were trying to embarrass me, because they genuinely had no idea. And that was the point. After answering a few questions, I looked toward my mother. Then I said the one thing I'd been thinking for years. "You know, none of this was a secret." The room quieted again. I kept my voice calm. I never hid what I was doing. I just stopped bringing it up because nobody seemed interested. My mother looked down. I continued. "Most of the people in this room know more about my work than my own family does. Not because I excluded anyone, because nobody ever asked." That statement hit harder than any angry speech could have. No yelling, no accusations. Just the truth. I glanced at Lauren. For the first time all evening, she looked uncomfortable enough to avoid eye contact. Deep down, I think she knew exactly what I meant. The issue had never been her success. I was happy for her. The issue was that our family had spent decades celebrating one daughter while barely noticing the other. Now that pattern was impossible to ignore. Guests had seen it happen in real time, and judging by the expressions around the room, many of them were realizing just how unfair it looked. My mother opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, then closed it again. There was simply nothing left to argue with. The days after the party were surprisingly quiet. Then the phone call started. Relatives who rarely contacted me suddenly wanted to catch up. Some acted as though they had always supported my career. Others conveniently forgot years of jokes, comparisons, and dismissive comments. One cousin asked if I would be willing to offer business advice. An uncle wanted to discuss a potential investment opportunity. A family friend wondered if I could introduce him to someone in my professional network. The sudden interest would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. For years, most of these people had accepted my mother's version of who I was without question. Now they were scrambling to update their opinions. A few people genuinely impressed me, though. Several relatives called simply to apologize. Not because they wanted anything, because they realized they had participated in something unfair. Those conversations meant far more to me than the requests and favors. As for my mother, the aftermath was much harder for her. Multiple relatives who attended the party contacted her afterward. Some questioned why she had spoken about me that way. Others pointed out how uncomfortable the entire scene had been. For the first time, she found herself on the receiving end of the kind of embarrassment she had spent years creating for me. People weren't criticizing her because I was successful. They were criticizing her because she clearly hadn't bothered to know her own daughter. That was the part she couldn't explain away. The story she'd told everyone for years had collapsed in a single evening, and now she had to live with the fact that dozens of people had witnessed it happen. Still, despite everything, one question remained unanswered. Would any of this actually change our relationship, or was it simply another moment that would eventually be ignored? For a while, I kept waiting for some dramatic resolution, an emotional apology, a family meeting, a moment where everyone finally acknowledged what had happened. It never came, at least not in the way I imagined. My mother eventually apologized, but it was hesitant and imperfect. Years of habits don't disappear overnight. She wasn't suddenly transformed into a different person, and I stopped expecting her to be. Oddly enough, that realization brought me peace. For most of my life, I'd been chasing something I could never control. Approval, recognition, validation. I kept believing that if I worked hard enough, succeeded enough, or proved myself enough, the people who underestimated me would finally change their minds. The party taught me something different. Their opinion had never been the prize. My freedom began the moment I stopped needing it. I started setting healthier boundaries. Conversations that turned disrespectful ended quickly. Comparisons were no longer tolerated. If someone wanted a place in my life, they needed to treat me with the same respect I gave them. Some relationships improved. A few relatives made genuine efforts to get to know me beyond the role I'd been assigned for years. Others drifted away when they realized old patterns no longer worked. And honestly, that was fine. Not every relationship is meant to survive forever. The biggest change happened inside me. For the first time, I stopped measuring my worth through my family's eyes. I didn't need to defend my accomplishments. I didn't need to announce them. And I certainly didn't need permission to be proud of them. The peace that came from accepting that was worth more than any business achievement I'd ever earned. When people hear this story, they often assume the best part was watching my mother get proven wrong, and I'll admit, there was something satisfying about that moment. Not because she was embarrassed, because the truth finally had a chance to speak for itself. Looking back, I don't think that party revealed who I was. It revealed who everyone else had chosen to believe I was. For years, my mother had been so focused on comparisons that she stopped paying attention. She saw Lauren as the successful daughter and me as the one still trying to catch up. Once that story settled into her mind, she filtered everything through it. No achievement was big enough to challenge it. No evidence was strong enough to change it. The irony is that my success was never hidden because it was small. It was hidden because nobody cared enough to look. The information was there all along. The company existed. The work existed. The accomplishments existed. But assumptions are powerful things. When people think they already know your story, they often stop listening. That's the lesson I carried away from that night. Not everyone who underestimates you deserves an explanation. Sometimes the most powerful response is continuing to build your life while others cling to outdated opinions. Success doesn't become real when someone finally recognizes it. It's real whether they recognize it or not. And respect should never depend on titles, income, popularity, or public recognition. Every person deserves dignity long before they've proven anything. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't that my family finally saw my accomplishments. It was realizing that I no longer needed them to, because true confidence begins when you stop asking others for permission to value yourself. And sometimes the people who spend years looking down on you discover far too late that they were standing next to greatness the entire time.